Hi, English students. It's good to see you all in this virtual world, and I hope you're all doing well wherever you are. Maybe you're at home, maybe you're on your cell phone watching this video. Today, you are going to learn about an incredible author, a genius author by the name of George Orwell. Take a look at your screen. He wrote one of my all-time favorite novels, and I'm so fortunate to be able to teach this novel, and I have for so many years. And the name of it is Animal Farm. It's the last novel that we're going to read this year. I know that you're going to fall in love with it just as much as I have, and you're going to learn not just about the fictional story, but about some real history that goes along with it. So before we begin learning about George Orwell, go to Google Classroom and open up your notes that are called George Orwell Biography Notes, and I'll wait for you right here. Okay, now that you're back, let's start learning about George Orwell. He was born in 1903, but take a listen to just a few seconds of this song written in 1902 by a famous piano player by the name of Scott Joplin. Old-timey music is a lot of fun. You can pretend to play the piano. Okay, that's enough of that for now. I just wanted to set the tone and hope you have some fun learning about George Orwell. So let's get started. So George Orwell was born in 1903, and his real name is actually Eric Arthur Blair. When he was born in India, and his father was a minor colonial official. But in 1904, he moved with his mother back to England, and he didn't really see his real father that very often unless he made rare trips back to England. For his schooling, his family didn't have much money, but he actually went to a very expensive English prep school. And so the other kids knew that he didn't have much money, and they kind of treated him like a charity case. That gave him a real sense of being an underdog, of understanding the plight of kids that don't have much money, the plight of the poor. He understood this class struggle, right? Which is going to help us when we read our novel, Animal Farm. Now, in 1917, he enrolled in a college called Eton College. It's in England, and that's where he began to become very independent. He got this personality. He didn't really accept class values, and he even professed atheism, which means you don't believe in God, and socialism, which means you believe in caring about all people equally, kind of giving everybody care instead of people having to struggle. Maybe we work together collectively. So again, that's going to be important to your understanding of the novel. But in 1921, he left college. He did not have a diploma, but that did not stop this genius. And as I'm sure you've heard about so many other genius authors or just geniuses in general, you don't always have to have a college education to become incredibly successful. So in 1922, after he left college, he took a test and he passed it to join what's called the Indian Imperial Police in Burma, and that was in 1922. He spent 5 long years as a police officer, and he really detested it. And so he ended up going back home to England after deciding that was just not the job for him. But between the years of about 1927 and 1933, he went on a journey that we would think a lot of maybe hippies would go on, which is where you go and you kind of travel and you go find yourself, right? You've probably heard of that. What Orwell did is that he tramped. It was called tramping, becoming a tramp, just like Lady and the Tramp, right? He tramped around Paris and he tramped around London, and he became a street beggar. And he did this in part because he was finding out what it was like to live in those conditions. But he did have some bad experiences. But if you're interested in reading that story, the story he wrote about is called Down and Out in London. Okay. But he did get sick. He contracted pneumonia, and this was the first sign of what would become later some future health problems. So when he ended his tramping around and he went back home, he adopted the pseudonym, it's also called a pen name, of George Orwell. And that's how you know about him. In 1934, we'll tag on that he also wrote his first fictional novel called Burmese Days. In 1936, he did get married. He met a woman named Eileen Maud O'Shaughnessy. It was a student that he met while he was in London, and he lived with her in England. But in 1937, having these very strong socialist ideals, he went to Spain. He joined the Spanish Civil War. And this was backed by communists, but he was wounded and he was discharged. And after his experiences, he felt disillusioned by the promises of communism, the promises even of socialism, and what the revolution promised to bring. So while he was in England, he returns. He devoted himself to just writing full time. And this is where you see novels that were coming out under that pseudonym, that pen name, George Orwell. In 1939, while he was in England, he had different jobs in order to make some money, including becoming a school teacher for a while. But he lived in a small village and he lived on a small farm. And he noticed that with the animals that he took care of, they seemed to live in harmony, and he felt a great responsibility to take care of them and for their well-being, even if they were animals that eventually you might, eat. He felt like you should take care of them, and he saw that in nature, that was the only place where there is a true utopia, right? A perfect balance. But during World War II, he worked for the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC. He was producing some wartime propaganda. And in 1944, he adopted a son. But only a year later, his wife, who had gone in for a surgery for a hysterectomy, she died on the surgery table. It was very tragic for him. Well, along that time, he wrote the novel Animal Farm. This was 1945. That was right in the thick of all of this turmoil happening in the world. In 1946, he moved to a Scottish island called Jura, but he found that life was really hard there. And a year later, he moved back to London. But he was very sick at that time, and he was diagnosed with tuberculosis. I know that if you had me as your teacher first semester, we learned so much about tuberculosis, what it does to your lungs, how you basically swallow and drown in all of the flesh and the blood that you're coughing up. It's a terrible disease. Reasons why we had sanatoriums, places where hundreds of thousands of people would go to get well, but they actually would die, right? Only a couple of years later in 1949, he was really hoping to fall in love again. Does that remind you of Edgar Allan Poe, right? So he started trying to court different women, and it turns out that he did marry a second wife. It was his editorial assistant named Sonia Bronwell, and he had to marry her in his hospital room in London, so that's pretty tough. But in 1950, George Orwell died of tuberculosis, and he's buried in a tiny, almost nondescript grave. It just has this marker that says, "Here lies Eric Arthur Blair." So here are some of his works. He wrote Down and Out in Paris and London in 1933. It's a nonfiction work. He describes his experiences among the poor. I will admit I've only read parts of it, and I was fascinated. I thought, wow, can you imagine someone really wanting to find out what it was like to be poor and you become a tramp? Burmese Days was in 1934. His colonial experiences, again, it was fictional. The Road to Wigan Pier, it was a report on the conditions of miners in the industrial north. Homage to Catalonia in 1938. This was all about his experiences with the Spanish Civil War and becoming disillusioned with the promises of a revolution. Inside the Whale, this was a collection of essays. And then The Lion and the Unicorn, Socialism and the English Genius. Wow, listen to that title, 1941. It was his essay expressing opinions of wartime Britain. Then, of course, we have in 1945, Animal Farm. It made him internationally famous and financially secure. Excuse me. And then, of course, you have the novel 1984. If you have not read this, and I feel like at least one or two of you out there have, if you have not yet read 1984, it could possibly change your life. And you will see many parallels to what happens in that book to what we are experiencing today, right? So, as far as his artistic development as a writer, as his English background, he wanted to experience new ideas, new impressions of things that were happening around the world, globally, socially, right? And so his writings, especially with 1984 and especially with Animal Farm, it shows conflicts between his middle class education, but also identifying with the working class, these guys that were working either in mines or in factories, working with your hands, working on farms, that kind of thing. But he felt like his role of himself as an artist, as an author, was to inform the public, sometimes with fictional narratives, and reveal facts about our world, satirically, and that it would help you draw conclusions between the facts and the fiction. And in turn, his role as an artist became a social function. So he is an author that as we read about animals, we're going to learn that he was really trying to teach us what we're like as humans. Okay. So many of his social themes, you could tell there were some influences from Charles Dickens, and he used very realistic language. He would often talk about the misery that's caused by poverty and living in want and the deprivation of society, the way that we don't care about one another. He definitely used his platform in our novel and other works to criticize what's called totalitarianism and the violation of your civil liberties and just tyranny in all of its forms. So it's time now for you to stop this video, but to click on the links in the PowerPoint. You definitely need to watch the quickbiography.com video called George Orwell, the First Hipster. I kind of like it because it's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek short video that's got some pretty cool facts about his first marriage, his illness, and his novels. It's kind of silly, but I think it's fun. It's a fun video. The next one is a really awesome history-packed video called History Brief, George Orwell. This video is going to help you understand his works. So what I've not taught you in this brief little biography, it's going to fill in the blanks with some of his other novels that we won't cover in your English class as a freshman. But also it kind of describes the historical context, which we're going to talk about in our Russian Revolution video. Okay, so that's it for today. Signing off, and I hope that you're all hanging in there. Be sure to finish these biography notes. See you next time.